She looked at our blind 3-year-old son and said the words no father should ever hear. "He's a burden. He'll never become anything. I'm done." Then she walked out the front door and never looked back. I stood there frozen, holding a frightened little boy whose tiny hands searched the air until they found my face, completely unaware that his mother had just erased herself from his life. I wish I could tell you that I ran after her, that I changed her mind, or that love somehow won that day. None of those things happened. The front door closed. The sound echoed through our quiet little house, and with it ended the family I thought would last forever. For years I blamed myself, wondering if I had missed the warning signs, if I could have protected my son from the kind of rejection no child should ever experience. But nothing could have prepared me for what would happen over the next 18 years. Because the little boy everyone pitied would grow into a young man the world admired. He would build a fortune that experts said was nearly impossible. And the woman who abandoned him without a second glance would one day return to stand on that very same porch. Only this time, she wasn't coming back because she loved her son. She was coming back because she believed he possessed something she desperately needed. What happened after that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. And before this story reaches its final chapter, a secret hidden for nearly 2 decades will force every person in this story to question what love, sacrifice, forgiveness, and family truly mean. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this are difficult to hear because they remind us that the greatest heartbreaks rarely come from strangers. They come from the people we trust the most. What you're about to hear is inspired by real-life experiences shared by families who faced abandonment, disability, extraordinary perseverance, and reconciliation, with identifying details changed to protect privacy. It is not simply the story of a mother who walked away. It is the story of a father who refused to surrender, a child who refused to let blindness define him, and a truth that remained buried until success forced it back into the light. At first glance, this may seem like another story about betrayal and revenge, but if you stay until the very end, you'll discover that the greatest surprise has nothing to do with wealth. It has everything to do with a decision made by one frightened young woman years before she became a mother, a decision that quietly shaped every tragedy and every triumph that followed. And when that truth finally surfaced, even the people closest to this family struggled to believe it. My name is Ethan Carter, and for most of my adult life I believed that hard work could solve almost any problem. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't famous. I worked long shifts as an electrician in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, where people knew one another well enough to wave from their porches and gossip over coffee before sunrise. I met my wife, Melissa, when we were both in our 20s. She had a smile that could brighten the dullest room and a confidence that pulled people toward her without effort. She dreamed of traveling across America, owning a beautiful home, and giving our future children opportunities neither of us had growing up. We weren't perfect, but we laughed often, argued over little things, apologized quickly, and believed our future was already written. Looking back now, I realized that life has a way of rewriting every plan we make. Sometimes it happens gradually. Sometimes it happens in a single sentence. For us, everything changed the day our son, Noah, entered the world. The delivery itself was difficult, and although the doctors reassured us that many newborn complications resolved with time, there was a concern they couldn't ignore. After weeks of examinations, specialists delivered the diagnosis every parent fears hearing. Noah had suffered irreversible damage to both optic nerves. He would never see our faces, the colors of the sky, or the smile of the father who promised to protect him. The room became painfully quiet as the doctor explained therapies, support systems, adaptive education, and the possibility of a fulfilling life despite complete blindness. I reached for Melissa's hand, expecting us to face the news together. Instead, I felt her fingers slowly pull away, and although I didn't understand it then, that tiny movement marked the beginning of the distance that would eventually separate us forever. The first few months after Noah's diagnosis became a test of everything we believed about ourselves. I threw myself into learning every resource available for blind children. I spent evenings reading medical journals, talking with specialists, listening to interviews from adults who had been blind since birth, and speaking with parents who had already walked the difficult road we were just beginning. Every conversation ended with the same message. Noah's life would be different, but it could still be meaningful, successful, and filled with purpose if he was surrounded by love, patience, and opportunity. Those words became my anchor. Melissa heard the very same advice, yet she seemed to hear something entirely different. Every appointment reminded her of the future she thought had been stolen. She stopped decorating the house, stopped making plans for vacations, and slowly stopped smiling altogether. Friends would visit with gifts for Noah, and she would excuse herself after only a few minutes, locking herself in our bedroom until everyone left. At first, I believed she simply needed time to grieve the future she had imagined. I told myself healing wasn't a straight path, and that couples often struggled after receiving difficult medical news about a child. I kept hoping that one morning she would wake up and see what I saw every time I held Noah in my arms. A little boy who laughed whenever he heard birds outside the window, who reached toward every familiar voice with complete trust, and who loved without knowing the world already judged him by something he could never change. Months turned into years, and although Noah grew stronger with every passing season, our marriage weakened in ways I couldn't ignore any longer. Melissa became obsessed with appearances. She spent hours scrolling through social media, looking at photographs of families traveling together, celebrating birthdays, watching their children play baseball, ride bicycles, and chase one another across green backyards. Every picture seemed to remind her of what she believed our family would never have. She rarely looked at the stories behind those smiling faces. She only saw the images and convinced herself everyone else had received the perfect life, while ours had been unfairly taken away. Whenever neighbors asked how Noah was doing, I proudly talked about the progress he was making through early intervention programs, how he was already identifying voices with incredible accuracy, recognizing objects by touch, and astonishing therapists with how quickly he adapted to new challenges. Melissa would interrupt before I finished, changing the subject or pretending she had somewhere else to be. It was as though every compliment about our son only deepened the pain she refused to confront. I suggested counseling more times than I could count. At first she agreed, but after only a handful of sessions she announced that therapy couldn't fix reality. According to her, everyone expected her to accept a life she never wanted, and she was tired of pretending everything would be okay. I listened, comforted her, reminded her that no one needed both of us, but every attempt to rebuild what we had seemed to disappear before it reached her heart. There were moments, however, that convinced me hope still existed. On Noah's third birthday, we held a small celebration in our backyard. Nothing extravagant, just a few neighbors, homemade food, balloons, music, and the people who had supported us from the beginning. Noah couldn't see the decorations, but he laughed every time another balloon brushed against his face. He clapped when everyone sang happy birthday and hugged every guest as if they had given him the greatest gift imaginable. Several people quietly wiped away tears because his joy was so genuine that it reminded everyone happiness doesn't depend on eyesight. That afternoon, I caught Melissa watching him from the kitchen window. For just a brief moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. Her expression softened, and I honestly believed she was beginning to reconnect with our son. Then one of our neighbors casually said, "He's going to surprise the world someday. That little boy has something special." Melissa immediately turned away without answering. Looking back now, I realized that sentence stayed with her for reasons none of us understood. While everyone else saw possibility, she saw a future she refused to believe could exist. She had already decided what Noah's life would become, and no amount of evidence was strong enough to change her mind. The argument that destroyed our family didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence. A few days after Noah's birthday, I came home from work and found several suitcases sitting beside the front door. At first, I assumed Melissa was organizing closets or preparing for a visit to her parents, but the expression on her face told me otherwise. She stood in the living room with folded arms while Noah sat on the carpet nearby, happily stacking textured blocks his therapist had recommended to improve his coordination. He smiled when he heard my footsteps and reached up for me without realizing that the world around him was about to change forever. I picked him up, kissed his forehead, and asked Melissa what was going on. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at Noah for several long seconds before looking directly into my eyes. What she said next would echo in my mind for the next 18 years. She told me she couldn't keep living a life built around hospitals, therapy sessions, financial stress, and constant uncertainty. She said she wanted freedom, opportunities, and the chance to build the future she had always imagined. Then, without emotion, she looked toward our little boy and spoke the words that still haunt me to this day. He's a burden. He'll never become anything. I'm done. At that moment, I still believed she was speaking out of frustration, that she would calm down after we talked. I had no idea that the papers waiting inside one of those suitcases would prove she had been planning this decision for far longer than I ever imagined. She handed me a large manila envelope without saying another word. Inside were divorce papers, custody documents giving me full parental responsibility, and a short handwritten note that simply read, "Don't try to find me." I read the sentence over and over because my mind refused to accept that the woman I had promised to spend my life with had prepared every detail before I ever walked through the front door that afternoon. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't a temporary decision made in anger. She had already met with an attorney, signed every page, packed nearly all of her belongings, emptied our joint savings account except for a few $100s, and arranged somewhere else to live. Every step had been carefully planned, while I believed we were still fighting to save our marriage. I remember asking her the same question again and again. How can you leave your own child? She never answered directly. Instead, she said she refused to spend the rest of her life watching dreams disappear one medical appointment at a time. She insisted Noah deserved someone stronger than her and claimed I had always been better suited for sacrifice. Then she picked up the last suitcase, walked toward the front door, paused only long enough to avoid stepping on one of Noah's toys, and left without turning around. The sound of her car disappearing down our quiet street felt louder than any thunderstorm I had ever heard. Noah reached toward the door after hearing it close and asked the simplest question a 3-year-old could ask. "Daddy, where did Mommy go?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. There are moments in life when truth feels too heavy for language, and that was one of them. I hugged him as tightly as I could and whispered the only promise I knew I could keep. "I'm here, buddy. I'll always be here." I had no idea that promise would become the foundation upon which the rest of our lives would be built. The weeks that followed became a blur of exhaustion, paperwork, grief, and responsibilities I had never imagined carrying alone. Every morning began before sunrise. I prepared breakfast, helped Noah get dressed, dropped him off at an early childhood development program designed for visually impaired children, rushed to construction sites where I worked 10-hour shifts wiring homes and commercial buildings, picked him up before the center closed, cooked dinner, cleaned the house, paid bills, washed clothes, read tactile storybooks with him until he fell asleep, and then stayed awake long after midnight trying to figure out how I was going to make enough money to survive another month. There were nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at stacks of unpaid medical bills, wondering whether I should sell the house before the bank forced me to. Every unexpected expense felt like another mountain placed in front of us. Noah needed specialized learning materials, orientation and mobility training, regular appointments with specialists, and adaptive technology that insurance refused to cover completely. I wasn't angry about spending money on my son. I would have given everything I owned for him without hesitation. What terrified me was the possibility that one day I simply wouldn't have enough left to give. Pride disappeared quickly. I accepted overtime whenever it was offered, repaired neighbors' electrical systems on weekends for extra cash, and even delivered groceries late into the night after Noah had fallen asleep under the watch of a trusted elderly neighbor. Sleep became a luxury instead of a necessity. But every morning, when Noah smiled after hearing my voice, somehow I found enough strength to keep moving. People often assume children who cannot see experience the world with less wonder. The opposite was true for Noah. He discovered beauty in ways most of us never notice because we're too distracted by what our eyes constantly demand. He recognized me by the rhythm of my footsteps before I even opened the front door. He could identify dozens of birds simply by listening to their songs outside his bedroom window. He knew when rain was approaching because he said the wind felt different against his face. If I walked into the room carrying coffee, he smiled before I spoke because he recognized the faint smell that clung to my work jacket every morning. Watching him taught me that blindness had never stolen his ability to experience life. It simply taught him to experience it differently. Yet despite his remarkable spirit, the world wasn't always kind. Some parents pulled their children away after playground conversations became uncomfortable. Others spoke about Noah as though he weren't standing beside them, assuming blindness somehow meant he couldn't understand pity. I learned that ignorance can wound just as deeply as cruelty. Instead of allowing bitterness to take root, I used every painful encounter as another opportunity to teach Noah something more valuable than resentment. I told him that people fear what they don't understand, and the greatest way to change a mind is not through anger, but through the life you choose to live. He was only 4 years old, but he listened with the seriousness of someone much older. Even then, there was something extraordinary growing inside that little boy, something no doctor could measure and no diagnosis could ever limit. By the time Noah turned 5, one of his teachers requested a private meeting that would leave me speechless. She explained that while other children his age were still learning simple classroom routines, Noah was memorizing entire stories after hearing them only once. He could repeat conversations word for word several days later, identify classmates simply by the sound of their breathing, and solve age-appropriate puzzles entirely through touch faster than children who could see every piece. At first I assumed she was simply encouraging an overwhelmed single father, but then she placed several assessment reports in front of me. Specialists had independently reached the same conclusion. Noah possessed an exceptional memory and an unusually advanced ability to process complex information through sound and pattern recognition. One evaluator wrote a sentence that I have never forgotten. His blindness has not limited his intellectual potential. If properly supported, this child may accomplish extraordinary things. I folded that report carefully and placed it inside the same old envelope that still contained Melissa's divorce papers. I don't know exactly why I kept those documents together. Perhaps because they represented two completely different predictions about my son's future. One declared he would never become anything. The other suggested there was no limit to what he might become. At that moment, I silently decided which prediction I would spend the rest of my life believing. From that day forward, I stopped asking whether Noah would be able to build a good life and started asking what I needed to do to remove every obstacle standing between him and his potential. I enrolled him in every program I could find for visually impaired children, even if it meant driving several hours before work or giving up the only day off I had each week. We learned Braille together at the dining room table because I refused to let him feel like he was facing any challenge alone. At first, my fingers stumbled over the raised dots, and Noah laughed every time I mixed up letters that he recognized instantly. Before long, he was correcting my mistakes with the confidence of a tiny teacher who enjoyed proving that his old dad still had plenty to learn. Those evenings became my favorite part of every week. We weren't just studying an alphabet. We were building a language that belonged to both of us. One that reminded Noah he was never different inside our home. If he struggled, we struggled together. If he celebrated, we celebrated together. Whenever he asked why other children could see while he couldn't, I never lied or filled his head with false promises. Instead, I told him something my own father had once told me after I failed at something important. Son, life doesn't choose everyone's starting line equally, but it does give every person the chance to decide how they'll run their race. Noah would smile, squeeze my hand, and quietly say, "Then I'll run as fast as I can." Even now, years later, I can still hear those words as clearly as if he had spoken them yesterday. Money, however, remained our greatest enemy. No amount of determination could erase overdue bills. Every month felt like a balancing act between keeping food on the table and paying for the tools Noah needed to learn. I sold my pickup truck and bought an older car with more than 200,000 miles on it because the payments were lower. I canceled every luxury we had, including cable television, vacations, restaurant dinners, and even birthday gifts for myself. Christmas became simpler than ever before, but Noah never complained. One December morning, when he was 6 years old, he handed me a small package wrapped in newspaper because we couldn't afford proper gift paper. Inside was a homemade Braille bookmark he had crafted during school. Running across the front were words his teacher had helped him emboss. "To the best dad in the world." I remember turning away before he noticed the tears filling my eyes. It wasn't because the gift was expensive. It wasn't. It probably cost less than $1 to make. It was because, despite everything he had lost before he was old enough to understand loss, He had somehow grown into the kind of child who measured wealth by love instead of possessions. That realization gave me strength on days when I thought I had nothing left to give. I often wondered whether Melissa ever thought about him on birthdays or holidays, whether she ever imagined how much he had grown, or whether she had closed that chapter of her life so completely that she no longer remembered the sound of his voice. Those questions visited me often, but I never searched for answers. If she wanted to disappear, I wasn't going to chase someone who had willingly walked away from the greatest gift either of us had ever been given. When Noah was 7, another unexpected opportunity arrived through a nonprofit organization that partnered with schools serving visually impaired students. They hosted a weekend technology camp where children learned to use screen readers, voice-controlled computers, and accessible educational software. To most families, it probably sounded like an ordinary enrichment program. To Noah, it was the first time someone placed a computer in front of him and said, "This machine can become your window to the world." I still remember the excitement in his voice during the drive home. He talked nonstop about how computers could read books aloud, answer questions, help people communicate across continents, and allow blind users to do jobs many people believed were impossible. While other children his age were asking for toys, Noah spent months asking whether we could someday afford a computer with the same accessibility features he had used at camp. I hated telling him we couldn't afford one, but I also refused to make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. So I began taking every extra shift available. I repaired electrical panels after work, installed ceiling fans on weekends, and accepted emergency service calls in the middle of the night. It took nearly 10 months, but eventually I saved enough to buy a refurbished computer with basic accessibility software already installed. The day I carried that box into our tiny living room, Noah ran his hands across it as though he had just discovered buried treasure. He thanked me so many times that I finally laughed and told him to stop before the neighbors thought I'd given him a sports car. Neither of us realized that the old refurbished computer sitting on our worn-out kitchen table would eventually become the first brick in an empire worth millions of dollars. Within weeks, Noah was using that computer more confidently than adults who had owned one for decades. He memorized keyboard shortcuts after hearing them only once, learned to navigate complex software entirely through audio feedback, and began teaching himself basic programming through free online courses designed for blind students. Whenever he encountered a problem, he treated it like a puzzle instead of an obstacle. He wasn't interested in proving people wrong. He simply loved solving problems. Teachers soon noticed that he wasn't merely completing assignments. He was creating his own projects outside of class, experimenting with ways to make websites and applications easier for visually impaired users to navigate. One instructor told me, "Mr. Carter, your son doesn't think like most children his age. He looks for solutions adults often overlook." Hearing those words filled me with pride, but they also reminded me of the cruel prediction Melissa had made years earlier. Every achievement Noah reached quietly erased another piece of that terrible sentence. Yet neither of us knew that someone far away, living a completely different life, would soon hear about a remarkable blind boy from Ohio whose story was beginning to attract attention far beyond his small hometown. And when that happened, the past we believed had been left behind would begin making its way back toward us, one step at a time. As Noah grew older, his curiosity became impossible to contain. By the time he was 9, our evenings no longer revolved around simple homework assignments. Instead, our dining room table was covered with notebooks filled with ideas he dictated into a small digital recorder before organizing them on his computer. He wasn't interested in becoming famous or proving anyone wrong. He simply wanted to make everyday life easier for people like himself. One night, while listening to a website through his screen reader, he became frustrated because the page wasn't designed for blind users. After struggling to complete what should have been a simple task, he looked at me and asked, "Dad, why do people build things without thinking about everyone who might use them?" It was a question I couldn't fully answer. I explained that many people simply didn't understand the challenges blind individuals faced because they had never experienced them. Noah sat quietly for a moment before saying something that would stay with me forever. "Then maybe I should build things that help them understand." It sounded like the innocent dream of a child, but there was a determination in his voice that made me believe he meant every word. That evening, while washing dishes after dinner, I caught myself smiling. For the first time since Melissa walked away, I wasn't thinking about everything our family had lost. I was thinking about everything my son might one day create. School quickly became a place where Noah stood out for reasons no one had expected. Teachers often paired him with students who were struggling because they noticed he had an unusual ability to explain difficult concepts in ways everyone could understand. His classmates stopped seeing him as the blind kid and began seeing him as the boy who always seemed to know how to solve problems. He joined debate clubs, participated in technology competitions using adaptive software, and regularly surprised judges with creative ideas that focused on accessibility rather than limitation. There were still difficult days. Some children teased him, assuming blindness meant weakness. Others underestimated him before competitions even began. Each time he came home discouraged, I reminded him that people often judge what they can see before they ever take time to understand what they cannot. Eventually, those same students who once questioned him began asking for his help with assignments. Respect replaced pity, and confidence slowly replaced every insecurity he had quietly carried during childhood. Watching those changes unfold felt like witnessing a seed pushed through concrete. Growth wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was relentless. Every challenge seemed to strengthen rather than discourage him. Meanwhile, I continued working long hours, never telling Noah how close we sometimes came to falling behind financially. I wanted him focused on learning, not worrying about bills. Looking back, I realized he probably understood far more than I gave him credit for. The breakthrough that changed everything arrived when Noah was 13. His middle school organized a regional innovation competition for students interested in solving real-world problems through technology. While many contestants built games or simple educational apps, Noah proposed something deeply personal. He designed the concept for software that could help blind users navigate complicated websites more efficiently by identifying inaccessible sections and offering audio-guided alternatives. The project was ambitious, especially for someone his age, and several judges privately admitted they weren't sure it could even be built. But Noah didn't focus on their doubts. For months, he worked late into the night refining every detail, learning new programming techniques, and asking online mentors questions until he found solutions. I often woke up before dawn and discovered him asleep at the kitchen table with headphones still resting around his neck and pages of Braille notes scattered beside his laptop. I worried he was pushing himself too hard, but every time I suggested taking a break, he smiled and said, "Dad, I don't feel like I'm working. I feel like I'm building something that matters." On the day of the competition, the judges listened politely as contestant after contestant presented their projects. Then Noah took the stage. He couldn't see the audience, but he didn't need to. He spoke with quiet confidence, explaining not what blind people couldn't do, but what technology should allow everyone to do. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Moments later, the audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. It was the first time I had ever seen complete strangers applaud my son, not because they felt sorry for him, but because they genuinely admired what he had accomplished. Winning that competition brought opportunities we had never imagined. Universities invited Noah to youth innovation programs. Technology companies offered mentorship. Local newspapers published articles about the remarkable teenager creating software to improve digital accessibility. Television stations began calling, hoping to feature his story. I was proud of every achievement, but I also became protective. Fame has a way of attracting people whose intentions aren't always pure, and after everything we'd been through, I wasn't willing to let anyone exploit Noah's story for sympathy or publicity. We accepted only opportunities that focused on his work rather than his disability. During one interview, a reporter asked him what motivated him to work so hard despite the challenges he faced. Noah paused before answering. "My father never treated blindness like the end of my story," he said. "He treated it like one chapter. If he believed in me when I couldn't even tie my own shoes, the least I can do is believe in myself now." I looked down because I didn't want the cameras to catch the tears filling my eyes. I had spent years wondering whether I was doing enough, whether I was making too many mistakes, whether Noah secretly resented growing up without a mother. In that single moment, every sacrifice felt worthwhile. But hundreds of miles away, someone watching that interview recognized the young man's voice, his last name, and the story of the father who had raised him alone. For the first time in nearly 14 years, Melissa stopped what she was doing and stared silently at a television screen. The past she had tried so hard to escape had suddenly found its way back into her living room. The weeks following the national award ceremony passed faster than either Ethan or Noah expected. Noah celebrated his 18th birthday quietly, insisting that he preferred dinner at home over a lavish party. Success had changed many things around them, but it had not changed the values Ethan had spent years teaching him. Their small dining room was filled with a handful of close friends, former teachers, neighbors who had watched Noah grow up, and the mentors who had believed in him long before investors and television hosts knew his name. As the evening came to an end, Noah stood to thank everyone for coming. He spoke about gratitude, resilience, and the importance of giving people opportunities instead of sympathy. Then, in front of everyone, he made an announcement that even Ethan had never heard before. Earlier that afternoon, the final contracts had been signed with a group of investors who valued his accessibility software company at more than $40 million. Although most of the company remained under Noah's ownership, the agreement instantly made him a multi-millionaire at only 18 years old. The room erupted into applause, but Noah didn't celebrate by talking about wealth. Instead, he walked over to Ethan, wrapped his arms around him, and quietly said, "Dad, every dollar I ever make belongs first to the man who never gave up on me." Ethan could barely respond. The little boy he had once carried through hospital corridors was now standing before him as a successful young businessman, and all he could think about was the promise he had whispered on the day Melissa walked away. Somehow, against every expectation, he had kept that promise. News of Noah's business valuation spread across the country within days. Financial magazines praised the young entrepreneur whose software was transforming digital accessibility. Major technology companies requested meetings. Universities invited him to deliver keynote speeches. Charitable organizations asked him to serve as an ambassador for disability inclusion. Every interview focused on his remarkable achievements. But Noah consistently redirected attention toward the millions of visually impaired people whose daily lives inspired his work. "Success isn't about proving someone wrong," he often said. "It's about making someone else's life better." Those words resonated with audiences across America because they reflected a maturity far beyond his years. Yet while the public admired Noah's humility, another pair of eyes followed every headline with growing urgency. Melissa read every article she could find. She watched every interview twice. She learned where Noah's company was headquartered, where Ethan now lived, and which charity events Noah regularly attended. Each new success made waiting feel more impossible. She told herself she simply wanted forgiveness before it was too late. But hidden beneath those thoughts was another reality she refused to confront honestly. Creditors were calling daily. Legal notices continued arriving in her mailbox. Medical expenses connected to a recent diagnosis had consumed nearly everything she still owned. She had reached a point where pride no longer paid the bills. Whether she admitted it or not, Noah's extraordinary success had become impossible to separate from her sudden desire to reconnect. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Ethan returned home earlier than usual after attending a board meeting at Noah's company. Retirement still felt strange to him. For decades, his days had begun before sunrise with work boots, tool belts, and construction sites. Now he spent more time volunteering, mentoring young fathers raising children with disabilities, and helping Noah evaluate charitable projects that deserved funding. He had just poured himself a cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Expecting a delivery driver, he walked casually toward the entrance without looking through the window. The moment he opened the door, every muscle in his body became still. Standing on the front porch was Melissa. Time had changed her in ways photographs never could. Fine lines framed her eyes. Her confidence had been replaced by hesitation, and the expensive elegance she once carried so effortlessly had given way to visible exhaustion. She held no luggage, only a worn leather handbag clutched tightly against her side. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. 18 years of unanswered questions seemed to fill the silence between them. Finally, Melissa whispered the first words she had spoken directly to Ethan since walking away. "I know I don't deserve to be here, but I need to see our son." Ethan stared at her without anger, without welcome, and without any expression she could easily understand. He had imagined this moment countless times over the years, Yet now that it had finally arrived, nothing he had rehearsed seemed appropriate. Before he could answer, footsteps approached from deeper inside the house. Noah, hearing unfamiliar voices through the open doorway, walked toward the entrance with the calm confidence that had become second nature to him. Neither Ethan nor Melissa realized that the next few seconds would become the most emotionally charged moment either of them had experienced in nearly 2 decades. Noah stopped several feet from the doorway and listened carefully. Most people assumed blindness deprived him of recognition, but those who truly knew him understood that memory had always been one of his greatest strengths. He remained silent for a moment, tilting his head almost imperceptibly as though searching through memories buried deep within childhood. Then, without anyone introducing her, he spoke in a calm voice that immediately sent tears streaming down Melissa's face. "That's her, isn't it?" Ethan slowly closed his eyes before answering. "Yes, son." Noah nodded almost as though he had expected this day to arrive eventually. "I remember her voice," he said quietly. "Not every detail, but enough." Melissa covered her mouth, overwhelmed that the child she had left at 3 years old still carried echoes of her voice after all this time. She took a cautious step forward, hoping perhaps for an embrace she had imagined during the long drive to Ohio. Noah didn't move. His face remained composed, neither hostile nor welcoming. Finally, he asked the question that froze everyone where they stood. "Why today?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't filled with bitterness. It was spoken with quiet sincerity, making it far more difficult to answer honestly. Melissa opened her mouth several times before any words emerged. She had spent weeks rehearsing apologies during lonely nights in her apartment, but now every carefully prepared sentence suddenly felt empty. Because deep inside, she knew that the question Noah had asked wasn't simply about the day she arrived. It was about every single day during the previous 18 years when she had chosen not to. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the porch floor, searching for words that somehow could bridge 18 years of silence. "Because I was afraid," she whispered at last. "Every year that passed made it harder to come back. I kept telling myself I'd do it tomorrow, then next month, then next year. Before I knew it, nearly 2 decades had disappeared." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had imagined hearing apologies countless times, but now that they were finally being spoken, they felt strangely distant. Noah remained standing beside his father, his expression calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "Fear explains why someone hesitates," Noah replied quietly. "It doesn't explain why someone never called, never wrote a letter, never sent a birthday card, never asked if I was alive." The question hung in the air like a weight no one could move. Melissa's shoulders trembled. She tried to answer, but every explanation sounded smaller than the pain it attempted to justify. Finally, she admitted the only truth she could no longer avoid. "Because every day I felt more ashamed than the day before." Ethan noticed tears running down her face, yet he also noticed something else. Every answer centered on how she had suffered. Not once had she described what Noah had endured. That realization unsettled him more than anything she had said since arriving. After several moments of silence, Ethan stepped aside and invited her inside. It wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was an act of respect for the son who deserved answers no matter how painful they might be. Melissa entered slowly, glancing around the home she had never seen before. Family photographs lined the walls, documenting birthdays, graduations, school competitions, fishing trips, and holidays she had completely missed. In every picture, Ethan and Noah were smiling together. She paused in front of one photograph showing Noah, still a young teenager, reading Braille beside Ethan at the kitchen table. Another showed Noah receiving a statewide academic award, while Ethan applauded proudly from the audience. There were dozens of memories, each one silently reminding her that life had continued without her. She reached toward a framed picture before quickly pulling her hand back, as though she no longer had the right to touch it. Noah noticed the movement, but said nothing. Instead, he led everyone into the living room, where an uncomfortable quiet settled over the house. Eventually, Melissa spoke again. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said. "I only wanted the chance to tell you both how deeply sorry I am." Noah nodded respectfully before asking another question. "If I hadn't become successful, would you still have come?" Ethan looked toward Melissa immediately. It was the question he himself had been wondering since she appeared on their doorstep. Melissa didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the family photographs covering the opposite wall. Her silence lasted so long that Ethan already knew the truth before she finally spoke. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "Maybe not." The honesty surprised both of them. It was painful, but it was at least honest. She explained that seeing Noah's interviews had forced her to confront everything she had spent years trying to bury. Watching him publicly thank the father who had raised him made her realize how much she had lost. "His success reminded me of what I abandoned," she said. "Without seeing those interviews, I might have kept pretending the past never happened." Noah absorbed every word carefully. "So success brought you here," he replied. "Not love." Melissa shook her head quickly. "No, that's not what I mean." But even she recognized how impossible it sounded. The timeline spoke for itself. 18 years without contact, then national recognition, then a visit. Ethan remained silent because experience had taught him that people often reveal more through uncomfortable pauses than lengthy speeches. Yet despite Melissa's confession, something still didn't fit. He had spent enough years reading people to know she was withholding part of the truth. It wasn't simply guilt that had brought her across the country. There was another reason, one she hadn't yet found the courage to admit. That evening, after nearly 2 hours of difficult conversation, Melissa prepared to leave for a nearby hotel. Before she reached the front door, Noah stopped her gently. "If we're ever going to move forward," he said, "there can't be any more hidden truths." Melissa nodded without turning around. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag. For several seconds, she stood perfectly still before slowly opening the bag and removing a thick folder filled with documents. She placed it carefully on the dining room table. Ethan looked down and immediately recognized medical records, legal notices, and financial statements. Melissa's voice broke as she finally revealed what she had been hiding from the moment she arrived. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney failure. I've been receiving treatment while trying to keep my job, but the medical bills have destroyed everything I had left. After the divorce, after losing my savings, I couldn't keep up anymore." She paused, struggling to continue. "When I saw Noah on television, I convinced myself I only wanted forgiveness. But the truth is, a part of me also hoped." Her voice faded into silence. Noah completed the sentence for her. "You hoped I could help you financially." Melissa closed her eyes and nodded. The admission echoed through the room with painful clarity. For the first time since she arrived, there were no more excuses, no more carefully chosen words, and no more illusions. Every hidden motive now lay exposed between them, and Ethan realized that the conversation they had just endured was only the beginning. The decision Noah made next would determine not only Melissa's future, but the legacy of everything Ethan had spent 18 years teaching his son. Noah remained seated for several moments without saying a single word. Most people expected anger after hearing Melissa's confession. Others would have understood if he had ordered her to leave immediately. Instead, he rested both hands on the dining room table and quietly asked Ethan if they could have a few minutes alone. Melissa nodded, picked up her handbag, and stepped outside onto the back patio. The evening air had turned cool, and for the first time since arriving in Ohio, she found herself completely alone with the consequences of a decision she had made 18 years earlier. Inside the house, Noah slowly turned toward his father. "Dad," he said softly, "all my life you've taught me to judge people by what they do, not just by what they say. I don't want pity deciding this conversation, and I don't want revenge deciding it either. I just need to know one thing." Ethan looked at his son carefully. "Anything?" Noah took a slow breath before asking the question that had quietly lived inside him since childhood. "When she left, did you ever hate her?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the family photographs lining the wall, remembering nights when exhaustion, fear, and loneliness had almost overwhelmed him. "There were days I thought I did," he admitted honestly. "But hate has a way of trapping the person carrying it. If I had spent 18 years hating your mother, I would have missed 18 years loving you. I chose the better investment." Those words settled over the room with remarkable calm. Noah smiled faintly because they sounded exactly like the father who had raised him. "That's why I asked," he replied. "Every time someone criticized her while I was growing up, you never joined in. You never told me she was evil. You never tried to make me resent her. I used to wonder why." Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Because she wasn't the lesson I wanted your life to become," he answered. "If I filled your heart with bitterness, then she would have continued controlling our lives long after she was gone. I wanted you free. Noah lowered his head thoughtfully. Those words explained something he had never fully understood as a child. His father had protected not only his future, but also his ability to choose compassion without being manipulated by resentment. That realization made the next decision even more difficult. After another long silence, Noah stood and walked toward the patio door. Ethan quietly followed a few steps behind. Melissa immediately stood when she saw them approaching, her face revealing both fear and fragile hope. Noah stopped a comfortable distance away. I believe your apology is sincere, he said calmly. But sincerity doesn't erase consequences. You didn't only leave my father. You left a frightened little boy who spent years wondering why he wasn't enough. Melissa broke down completely. She tried to speak through tears, but Noah gently raised his hand. Please let me finish. His voice remained steady, never harsh. I don't remember your face very clearly anymore. I remember your voice. I remember reaching toward the front door after it closed. I remember asking Dad where you went. I remember birthdays when I secretly hoped you'd surprise me. Every year that hope became a little smaller until one day it disappeared. Ethan quietly looked away, hearing memories he knew Noah had carried silently for years. The money I have today didn't heal those memories, Noah continued. Success doesn't erase abandonment. It simply gives people the illusion that pain disappears once you're wealthy. It doesn't. Melissa nodded repeatedly, unable to deny anything he said. But here's what my father taught me, Noah continued. People can refuse to become what hurt them. You abandoned someone when life became difficult. I refused to abandon someone simply because life became difficult for them. Melissa looked up in disbelief, unable to understand where the conversation was leading. Noah took another breath before finishing. I won't give you money because you're my mother. Biology alone doesn't earn that privilege. But I also won't turn my back on someone who genuinely needs help. Those are two very different things. The following morning, Noah arranged a meeting with the legal team that managed both his business affairs and his charitable foundation. Melissa expected him to write a personal check covering her medical expenses. Instead, he presented a carefully structured proposal. Every verified medical bill connected to her kidney treatment would be paid directly to the hospital through the foundation's humanitarian assistance program. Independent financial advisors would help her eliminate unnecessary debt, create a realistic budget, and secure stable housing. No cash would be transferred directly to her. There would be no luxury lifestyle restored, no inheritance promised, and no ownership in his company. Everything would be handled transparently through professionals. Melissa quietly reviewed the documents before tears filled her eyes once again. You don't trust me, she whispered. Noah answered gently. Trust isn't rebuilt with one conversation. It's rebuilt through time and consistent choices. My father spent 18 years earning mine. Ethan watched silently as Melissa signed the assistance agreement. She seemed almost relieved that Noah had established boundaries instead of allowing emotion to control the situation. Deep inside, she realized that the greatest wealth her son possessed wasn't the millions listed on financial statements. It was the wisdom to separate compassion from manipulation. Several months passed. Melissa remained in Ohio, renting a small apartment close to the medical center where she received treatment. She began attending counseling, not because anyone required it, but because for the first time she genuinely wanted to understand the fear that had governed so many of her decisions. She also volunteered twice each week at a nonprofit serving visually impaired children. During the first few visits, she struggled emotionally. Every child she met reminded her of Noah at 3 years old. Every parent sitting beside hospital beds reminded her of Ethan. Rather than running from those painful memories again, she stayed. She learned Braille alongside children just beginning their education. She read audiobooks for families whose schedules made reading difficult. She listened to parents describe sleepless nights, financial worries, and uncertain futures. Instead of seeing burdens, she finally saw courage. Meanwhile, Noah expanded his company internationally while launching scholarships for blind students pursuing careers in technology. At the dedication ceremony for the first scholarship, he stood before hundreds of guests and announced that the program would carry a name that surprised everyone in attendance. It would be called the Ethan Carter Opportunity Initiative, honoring the father whose unwavering belief had changed not only one child's life, but countless others who would benefit for generations. As the audience applauded, Ethan quietly shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. Noah smiled and placed an arm around his father's shoulders. "You spent your life building homes for other families," he said into the microphone. "Without realizing it, you also built the foundation of mine." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Melissa stood near the back, listening quietly. She didn't approach the stage. She didn't ask for recognition. She simply applauded with everyone else, fully understanding that the greatest chapter of Noah's life had been written without her. For the first time, accepting that truth no longer filled her with jealousy. It filled her with gratitude that someone else had loved her son enough when she had failed to do so. As guests slowly left the ceremony, Noah joined his father outside beneath the evening sky. Ethan smiled and asked, "Do you ever wonder what your life would have looked like if things had happened differently?" Noah thought for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember something you always told me. Life doesn't choose everyone's starting line equally. It simply gives us the chance to decide how we'll run our race. I think we ran ours pretty well. There are stories that end with revenge, where every wound is repaid in equal measure. There are others that end with easy forgiveness, pretending deep scars disappear after a single apology. This wasn't either of those stories. It was a story about consequences that remained real, forgiveness that required wisdom instead of forgetfulness, and a father's decision to answer cruelty with unwavering love." Melissa could never recover the birthday she missed, the first words she never heard, the graduation she never attended, or the frightened little boy who waited by the front door believing his mother would return. Those moments belong to the past forever. But Ethan proved that one faithful parent can change the entire direction of a child's life. Noah proved that blindness never determines the limits of human potential. And together they demonstrated that true success isn't measured by millions of dollars or national recognition. It's measured by the lives transformed through compassion, perseverance, integrity, and hope. So if you found yourself standing where Noah stood, would you have made the same decision? Would you have helped the person who once abandoned you? Or would the pain have been too great to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if stories like this remind you that resilience can triumph over rejection, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable journey.